Christianity isn't collapsing because people hate it. That's the story everyone tells. But what if that's wrong? What if Christianity is fading in America for a quieter reason, a more uncomfortable one? Not persecution, not atheism, not rebellion, but something far more dangerous. What if people didn't reject Christianity? They simply stopped needing it. Tonight, we're not talking about enemies of faith. We're talking about a shift in the human mind. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. When belief was necessary, for most of human history, belief was not a preference. It was a condition of survival. Religion was not something you debated on weekends or questioned in private. It was the frame through which reality itself made sense. Without it, the world was terrifying, random, and unbearably fragile. Imagine living in a time when the sky could kill you, when a sudden storm was not weather but intent, when drought meant starvation and famine meant extinction. You did not ask why clouds moved or why the ground cracked open. You asked who was angry. You asked what had been done wrong. Belief turned chaos into narrative, and narrative into something a human mind could endure. Religion explained what could not be controlled. Disease was not invisible bacteria. It was punishment or testing. Death was not an ending with no answers. It was a transition, a passage, a continuation of meaning beyond the body. When a child died, belief did not erase the pain, but it wrapped the pain in purpose. It told parents that this loss was seen, counted, and somehow necessary. Faith also created order where none naturally existed. It told people how to live, who they were, and where they belonged. It defined right and wrong long before law codes were written. It kept communities together through shared rituals, shared fears, and shared hopes. In a world where tomorrow was never guaranteed, belief was stability. Most importantly, belief answered the most dangerous question a human can ask. Why am I suffering? Without religion, suffering is just pain. With religion, suffering becomes meaningful. It becomes a test, a lesson, or a path toward redemption. That transformation alone made belief indispensable. Faith was not merely comforting, it was architectural. It structured time, morality, identity, and destiny. It told people who they were before they ever had the freedom to ask for themselves. And for thousands of years, this structure held. But quietly, slowly, almost invisibly, the conditions that made belief necessary began to shift. Not through rebellion, not through argument, but through change so gradual that no one noticed it happening. And that is where everything begins to turn. The world became explainable. The change did not arrive as an attack on belief. It arrived as clarity. Slowly, almost politely, mystery began to shrink. Not all at once, and not with the intention of replacing faith, but with the quiet confidence of explanation. What once demanded reverence started to invite understanding. Lightning stopped being a warning or a sign. It became a reaction, something measurable, predictable. You could trace it, study it, even harness it. The sky no longer spoke. It obeyed laws. And once something obeys laws, fear loosens its grip. Illness followed the same path. Sickness was no longer a judgment or a test of faith. It became cells, viruses, chemistry. Pain had a source that could be seen under a microscope. Healing no longer required confession or prayer alone. It required knowledge, treatment, time. The body became a system instead of a sentence. As these explanations multiplied, the universe changed its tone. It stopped feeling personal. Events were no longer happening to you for a reason. They were happening because of causes. Forces without intention, processes without morality. The world became understandable, but also colder. And here is the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Religion did not lose influence because science disproved God. That was never the real threat. Religion lost influence because science took over its role. It answered the questions belief once owned. Why does this happen? How can this be fixed? What will happen next? When answers became accessible, faith stopped being the first place people turned. Not because they stopped believing, but because they stopped needing belief as their primary tool for survival. Knowledge worked faster. It worked more reliably, and it did not require interpretation. But this shift created a subtle psychological consequence. When explanations no longer required meaning, meaning itself started to feel optional. People gained control, but lost narrative. They could explain the world, yet felt less anchored within it. And that is the turning point many miss. The real transformation was not scientific, it was emotional. Once the world could be explained without intention, humans began to ask a deeper question. If events are not personal, then what is my place in all of this? And from that question, an entirely new way of thinking began to form. Morality without God. For most of human history, morality and God were inseparable. Right and wrong did not emerge from discussion or empathy. They descended from above. Authority came from heaven, carried by scripture, tradition, and fear of judgment. To be moral was not a choice, it was obedience. And obedience was enforced by the promise of reward and the threat of eternal consequence. This structure made sense in a fragile world. When survival was uncertain and communities were small, morality needed teeth. The idea that someone was always watching, always judging, kept order when no police, courts, or shared social systems existed. God was not just a spiritual figure, God was the ultimate enforcer. Then something radical happened, quietly and without ceremony. Modern societies began to test an idea that once felt impossible. What if people could be good without fear? What if compassion did not require punishment as its backdrop? And to the surprise of many, it worked. People helped strangers without expecting heaven. They followed laws without believing they were divinely written. They felt guilt, responsibility, and care, not because God commanded it, but because empathy demanded it. Morality began to emerge from human experience rather than divine authority. You could care about others without fear of hell. You could feel accountable to your community instead of the cosmos. You could seek meaning through relationships, creativity, and contribution without asking for permission from above. Ethics became something you practiced, not something you inherited. Once that door opened, belief shifted its role. God was no longer the foundation holding morality together. Faith became one explanation among many, not the source of all answers. And when morality proved capable of standing on its own, belief lost its urgency. This did not make faith false, it made it optional. And options are fragile. Necessities endure because they must. Options survive only as long as they feel useful. When morality no longer required God to function, belief stopped feeling like bedrock and started feeling like preference. That subtle change altered everything. Because once people realize they can live well without belief, they begin to ask a dangerous question. If goodness does not need God, then what exactly does God still provide? And that question does not fade easily. The generation gap that never closed. This is where the change stopped being gradual and started accelerating. Not through rebellion, not through hostility, but through inheritance, quietly breaking down. For centuries, belief passed from parent to child almost automatically. You believed because your parents believed, and they believed because their parents did before them. Faith moved through generations like language. It did not need to be justified. It simply was. That chain began to weaken. Not because parents suddenly became careless or indifferent. Most still wanted to pass on their values, their traditions, their sense of meaning. But the world their children grew up in no longer required belief to function. Daily life worked without it. Schools explained what religion once did. Technology answered questions instantly. Institutions replaced rituals. Children learned to question early, not as an act of defiance, but as a habit. When something did not make sense, they searched for answers. They Googled, they compared sources. They encountered multiple explanations side by side, all competing for attention. Authority no longer felt absolute, it felt provisional. And when these children brought their questions back to faith, something crucial happened. They did not encounter mystery framed as depth. They encountered gaps. Silence where clarity was expected. Or worse, certainty offered without explanation, phrases repeated instead of reasons given, confidence without understanding. For a questioning mind, that response is devastating. It does not feel sacred, it feels evasive. The result was not anger, it was disengagement. When questions are met with silence, curiosity does not turn into belief, it turns away. Over time, that silence widened into distance. Belief stopped feeling alive and started feeling inherited but unused, like a language no one speaks fluently anymore. This is the generation gap that never closed. Parents spoke in terms of faith formed in a different world. Children listened with minds shaped by another reality entirely. Both sides meant well. Both sides misunderstood each other. And in that misunderstanding, belief did not collapse, it simply failed to transfer. Slowly, quietly, one generation at a time, silence replaced certainty, and certainty replaced faith. And once belief stops being inherited, it must justify itself to survive. When faith became political, then came the moment that shifted perception permanently. Faith did not just guide lives anymore, it reached for power. What had once spoken from the margins of politics stepped directly into its center. Churches aligned themselves with parties, belief fused with ideology, and spiritual language began to echo campaign slogans. Suddenly, God had opinions about taxes, borders, and elections. Sermons sounded less like reflections on meaning and more like arguments about policy. For some, this felt like clarity. For many others, it felt like intrusion. Faith was no longer pointing beyond the world, it was taking sides within it. That shift was deeply unsettling, not because people disliked politics, but because they expected faith to stand apart from it. Religion had always claimed moral authority precisely because it was supposed to rise above temporary power struggles. When it entered them, that authority changed shape. Once faith becomes political, it stops feeling sacred. Sacred things are meant to be universal, enduring, and larger than any moment. Politics is the opposite. It is temporary, transactional, and divided by nature. When belief adopts the language of power, it begins to sound like strategy instead of truth. For many observers, this alignment raised an uncomfortable suspicion. If faith supports a party, is it revealing divine will or protecting influence? If moral certainty appears only when power is at stake, is it conviction or convenience? These questions lingered even for those who still believed. The damage was subtle but lasting. Spiritual authority depends on trust. It depends on the sense that faith speaks because it must, not because it benefits. Once belief is seen as a tool, even a well-intentioned one, that trust erodes quickly. People did not need to reject religion outright, they only needed to doubt its independence. And once doubt enters that space, every message is reinterpreted through suspicion. Is this guidance or persuasion? Is this faith or control? In trying to influence the world, belief lost the distance that once gave it power. And without that distance, its voice no longer sounded timeless. It sounded partisan, and that perception would prove difficult to undo. The rise of the self. Modern life introduced a shift that religion was never designed to compete with. The center moved inward. Meaning was no longer something discovered outside the self, it became something constructed within it. Where belief once pointed upward, culture began pointing inward. Meaning became personal, truth became subjective, identity became sacred. These were not slogans, but lived experiences. People were encouraged to look inside themselves for answers, to trust their feelings, to define who they were without external permission. Fulfillment was framed as self-expression rather than obedience. The most revealing change was the question people began asking. It was no longer, "What does God want from me?" It became, "What feels authentic to me?" That question sounds harmless, even healthy. But it fundamentally rewired authority. When authenticity becomes the highest value, anything that challenges the self feels like a threat rather than guidance. Religion had always required surrender. Not annihilation of the self, but humility before something greater. That posture became difficult in a culture that treated the self as the final reference point. External authority struggled not because it was wrong, but because it was no longer central to identity formation. The self became the altar. Personal experience became scripture. Emotional resonance replaced tradition. If something felt true, it was true. If it felt restrictive, it was rejected. Belief systems were evaluated not by their depth, but by how they made individuals feel about themselves. This shift did not produce open hostility toward religion. It produced indifference. Faith was no longer attacked. It was bypassed. When people believe they are the primary source of meaning, they no longer seek it elsewhere. Religion became one voice among many, competing with therapy, self-help, and personal philosophy. And this is a uniquely quiet kind of decline. There are no arguments to win, no doctrines to dismantle, only a slow reorientation of attention. The self does not argue with God, it simply replaces him. That replacement does not feel like loss in the moment, it feels like empowerment. But over time, something subtle disappears. Not belief itself, but the sense of being accountable to something beyond the self. And once that accountability fades, faith loses its gravitational pull. How beliefs really die. There is a comforting myth people cling to when they talk about belief. The idea that beliefs only die when they are attacked, when enemies rise, when arguments are won, when something is forcefully torn down. That story feels dramatic. It gives decline a villain. But that is not how beliefs actually disappear. Beliefs die when they stop answering the questions people care about. Not the old questions, but the living ones. The ones shaped by the present moment. When a belief no longer helps someone make sense of their fear, their suffering, or their identity, it does not need to be disproven. It simply becomes irrelevant. There are no protests when this happens, no revolutions, no burning books, nothing loud enough to signal collapse. What replaces conflict is something far more dangerous: disinterest. People stop arguing because they stop caring. Churches are not stormed, they are slowly emptied. Pew by pew, generation by generation, rituals continue, but without conviction. Words are spoken, but they feel hollow. Prayers are recited, but they do not reach the place they once did. This kind of decline is hard to notice because it looks peaceful. Traditions remain visible, but their meaning fades. Belief survives in form, but not in function. It becomes cultural memory rather than lived truth. That is not destruction. It is drift. Drift happens when nothing pulls you back, when there is no urgency, no necessity, no unanswered question demanding return. People do not decide to leave belief behind. They simply stop returning to it. One missed service becomes a habit. One unanswered doubt becomes a pattern. Over time, absence feels normal. And drift is almost impossible to stop because it feels natural. There is no moment to resist, no line crossed, only a slow movement away from center. By the time anyone notices, the distance is already vast. Beliefs can survive attack. Attack keeps them alive through opposition, but they rarely survive neglect. Because neglect does not challenge belief, it starves it. And once belief stops being fed by relevance, it does not need to be destroyed. It dissolves. What this really means: this is not a celebration, and it is not a warning. It is an observation, one that sits uncomfortably between hope and loss. Christianity in America is not ending because it failed, and it is not disappearing because it was defeated. It is being outgrown by a culture that no longer asks the same questions it was designed to answer. That distinction matters. Failure implies error. Defeat implies conflict. Outgrowing implies change. It suggests that the environment shifted, not that the belief system suddenly became false. The world that once needed Christianity for structure, meaning, and moral grounding is not the world most people wake up in today. The deeper issue is not whether faith can survive in this new landscape. Institutions often adapt, traditions evolve, beliefs repackage themselves. The real question cuts much closer to the bone. If faith recedes, can meaning remain? Because humans do not stop searching when belief fades. They do not become empty or indifferent by nature. The need for purpose, for coherence, for something that makes suffering bearable, does not vanish. It relocates. People search in work, relationships, identity, progress, and self-understanding. They build meaning piece by piece instead of receiving it whole. This shift feels empowering at first. Choice replaces inheritance. Autonomy replaces obedience. But it also carries a quiet weight. When meaning is no longer shared, it becomes fragile. When everyone must construct it alone, it becomes easier to lose. Christianity once offered a shared narrative that stretched beyond individual lives. It placed personal pain inside a larger story. Without that framework, meaning becomes personal, but also isolated. Each person carries the burden of making life matter on their own. That is the unresolved tension of this moment. Not whether Christianity survives, but whether something equally deep takes its place. Whether a culture built on explanation, autonomy, and choice can still sustain awe, humility, and purpose. Humans will keep searching, that much is certain. The only question is where that search leads, and whether what they find can carry the same weight. Every civilization believes its beliefs are permanent, until they aren't. Religion doesn't disappear overnight, it fades when certainty feels unnecessary. Christianity isn't being defeated, it's being replaced by something quieter. Individual meaning, personal truth, inner authority. Whether that's progress or loss, depends on what replaces it. But one thing is certain, comforting beliefs last only as long as they feel necessary, and truth, real truth, survives questioning. If this made you uncomfortable, good. That's where thinking begins. If you value truth over comfort, stay curious. And if you're willing to question what you were taught, subscribe. Because the most dangerous belief is the one you never examine.